all come back at the end of President Obama's term. So let me just start with a sort of broadly general question, which is, and I'll start with my colleague Chris, and since we have two Chris's on the panel, I may just refer to that Chris as the Fix.
That would be fine.
As he often refers to himself. He even refers to his son.
In the contract.
He even refers to his son as Fix Jr. on his blog. So let me start with the Fix, and then work down the panel, which is, where do you see President Obama now? And Chris actually put a couple of issues on the table, which, in judging that, which include, how does his style contribute to that, and also how does the changing mood in Washington since the days the class of '83 were here, how does that contribute to it? And by the way, Ron, class of '83, brought along his own cheering section, including his wonderful wife.
Wow, nice. You always got to seed the audience. So where he is now, I mean, I think where he is now is that he is the sort of best campaigner in the country by far. He's the best candidate that we've seen. He is someone with real, whether you like him or, I always say this to people, almost everybody feels one way or the other, whether you like him or you dislike him, he's tremendous gifts as a candidate. Speaking ability is obviously well known. Less people pay less attention to it. He's the first guy to raise $1 billion ever. He is someone who is very gifted at those things. I think he has struggled more, and I think his aides, including my year is now his senior advisor, would agree that he struggled more on the governance side of things. Now, because I write a blog, I can hear the people in the comments section saying, well, he struggled because Republicans have blocked him. That is in part true, though. It's in somewhat large part true, though I would remind people that when he was elected, he had a Democratic-controlled House and Senate. He could not get health care, eventually got through, but it was certainly not how they would want it to have gone through. The stimulus went through with a few votes from Republicans, one of whom wound up switching and becoming a Democrat, Arlen Specter. The question, I think, as you go forward, and EJ, you've written a lot about this, is Barack Obama, if you read the span of his career, and I would urge you to read our colleague David Marinis's book, which is amazing, about Obama and who he is, always has seen himself as someone who can sort of bridge the unbridgeable gap. That he's just a guy who, in the state legislature, in his life in general, his life story is unbelievable. Again, whether you like him or dislike him, it's kind of unbelievable that this kid, David Marinis, went to Indonesia and sort of stood on the street that Barack Obama lived on as a young kid. He thought, this is as far as you possibly could be from being elected to the White House. And I think that's a good way to think, that's amazing that person gets elected. But he's always been uniquely gifted and feels himself uniquely able to bridge unbridgeable divides, to solve problems that no one else can solve. When he ran in 2008, it was premised, at least in part, on the fact that government is broken and I'm the one who can fix it. He has not so far done that. Again, blame lies in a lot of places, including in large part, I think, with Republicans who found their voice in opposing him. But again, he made a big pledge that he was going to change how Washington worked. He has not yet done that. Gun control is the latest example where, including by some of his own party, he struggled. So I think his legacy is a little bit up in the air in terms of his governance record. I would say his record as a candidate is hard to argue with. He beat Hillary Clinton in a primary, and then he won, 365 and then 350 something electoral votes. So, or 332. So, his electoral record's pretty damn good. Chris?
Well, the way I look upon it, I think I'm the only panel member here who lives currently way beyond the Beltway. And when I was a student here, I remember, and then worked on the Hill, I remember people referring to Washington as 67 square miles surrounded by reality. So I'm back in the hinterlands. Those of you who may read my blog, Straight Scoop Politics, or see me on some of the TV interviews know that while I have run for office as a Democrat, I'm an independent political analyst. And this is how I see it. I see any president who builds a legacy, there's really two significant elements. One is the turf that they're operating in, and the second is their leadership skills to get the job done in that climate. Now, I recall, and some of you may have worked, one of the beauties of going to Georgetown is, as we all know, we have opportunities to work on the Hill when we're going through school, and I did that when I was an undergraduate here and at law school, and that was back in the 80s and the 90s, and the environment down here was so different. The travel budgets for members of Congress were very low, so many members stayed in Washington over weekends. That was, these are what I want to call the three elements that made life more productive and efficient in government way back when. Now, it still was political, but these are the elements. One was the travel budgets. Members were here. I mean, you would often go into the Monocle restaurants on the Hill, you'd go into churches on Sunday, and you'd see members around. And so on Friday, they'd be killing each other on the floor of the House and the Senate. But by the time they played cards together over the weekend or had dinner at each other's houses, very often on Monday, not in all cases, but on Monday they were able to cut a deal on something. Number two, we didn't have all these wonderful stations like C-SPAN and all the cable networks. And because of that, there wasn't a 24/7 news cycle. So people who served in the House and the Senate, and I knew this well when I was a state legislator as well, you could take a tough vote. And the president would be working with people who could take tough votes, and they'd have enough time to go home and explain it to their constituents before they were being blasted all over the TV. So, and the third element is the money. Obviously, we all know campaign financing has just skyrocketed. And so back in those days, for a 4-year presidential cycle, you at least had 2 years to work some things out that may be controversial. And in a 2-year congressional cycle, you had at least the first year before it really got super political. And now, as we all know, there's no stop. Everybody's already talking about 2016. So when President Obama came in, he has today's climate, and that is a very tough climate to deal with. But the second factor is, you know, Barack Obama is not Bill Clinton. Barack Obama, if you watched him as I have, and I'm sure you have the last few years, he loves being the chairman of the board. He doesn't really enjoy the nitty-gritty of being the CEO and running the country. Bill Clinton was very detail-oriented. When I was a Senate Chief of Staff, he'd be working the phones constantly, and he knew the nuances of legislation. Thanks to a Georgetown grad who's now the Chief of Staff to the President, you know, he's been starting this schmooze routine by inviting members of the House and the Senate to dinner. But it's a little bit too late. You know, you have to have built those relationships in the first term in order to build on that, and he hasn't. Can it work? It can work, but it's difficult to pick up when you're starting now. Plus, I don't know if some of you saw the New York Times magazine section article. It was a few years back, about 4 years back, that it was a little bit too psychological, I think, for me. But it talked about his upbringing and how his relationship or not relationship with his father affects his dealings with other people, and how it makes him reluctant to really get close and deal with some members of Congress to work things out. I don't know if that's true or not because I don't know him that well, but I know that the leadership part of it and his campaigning, you know, the fix, Chris is absolutely right. He's terrific out on the hustings. We've seen him do that. But the more he does that, the more it antagonizes the Republican side. It makes it tougher for him to cut a deal. So, you know, he has to balance off that part of it. And I can talk. I don't want to go on too long because I know Ron wants to participate, but some of those other issues we'll hopefully get to.
Sorry, Ron.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, look, I have a very different perspective than Chris and Christine, and I'll state my biases. I worked on both the 2008 and 2012 Obama campaign, and love President Obama. I also worked for President Clinton in both of his campaigns, and love President Clinton. But I think that the legacy of the Obama presidency is going to be one of the most significant in our time. And I think there are 4 parts to his legacy that are established already to make his presidency truly transformative. The first is the economic turnaround. You can agree or disagree with his economic policies, but just on the math, on the numbers, he will finish his presidency with the greatest percentage growth in the stock market, national wealth, housing prices, and the greatest nominal reduction of the deficit of any president in our history. So saving the 2 auto companies, turning around the economy, I think that will be a historic legacy. Secondly, healthcare reform. Ending the time in our country where people could lose their homes, their bank accounts, everything, because they didn't have healthcare coverage. That is a significant achievement. It's a historic achievement because I think it ends a 100-year project that began with President Wilson of building a social safety net, starting off with workers' comp and minimum hours, maximum working conditions, through the New Deal, Social Security, through the Great Society, Medicare, now with healthcare reform. I think our social safety net as a country is pretty much complete. I think that ended with President Obama, and I think that's a historic landmark. He ended 3 wars that began on September 11th. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and the war after Al-Qaeda that attacked us on September 11th, killing Osama bin Laden, bringing the other people responsible for it either to death or to imprisonment. And I think when you talk, I teach, as EJ mentioned, I teach on campus today. For children today, this is a war they have lived with since they were 9 years old. And for those wars to come to an end under this president is a tremendously significant achievement and a historic one. And finally, we just transformed our society in terms of inclusiveness in these 5 years, starting off with the fact we have our first non-white president, but well beyond that, what's happened in terms of our inclusion of gay and lesbian Americans, the revolution in gay marriage, which neither party was willing to touch in 2008, would be legal in more than half the states by the time President Obama is finished. Gays are serving openly in our military. The inclusion of Hispanics is a significant part of our national political system, and with comprehensive immigration reform, which I think will get done, making 11 million more people who are in this country, many of whom are Hispanic citizens. I think that inclusiveness, that change of the dominant paradigm in our society is also a historic landmark. So I think when you look at those 4 things, the economic turnaround, health care, ending the wars, and the inclusiveness of people of color, gays, Hispanics, all these changes in our society, I think those are 4 incredibly powerful historical changes we've seen under his presidency. And I think that's what the history books will look back and reflect on.
I just learned one thing, which is if I ever need a lawyer, I'm going to hire Ron McClain, although I know I wouldn't be able to afford him. But that was excellent. Let me go back to the beginning on President Obama, which is that to me there was always a potential contradiction in his original 2008 promise, even though you don't have to see it as a contradiction, and I don't think he saw it as a contradiction, which is on the one hand, he ran as the president who'd bring red and blue together. There's no red America, there's no blue America, there's the United States of America. And so this implied a degree of bipartisanship that proved to be absolutely impossible and was probably structurally impossible from the day he walked into the White House. On the other hand, he promised to be a progressive reformer who'd really change the country. And indeed, on your list, notably, healthcare, Dodd-Frank financial reform, and some of the things that actually happened inside the stimulus, there was that sort of reform. But that he's been caught between the two and kind of judged often on the basis of one, not the other. And at times, he seems to have made people on both sides unhappy. Let me start with Ron on that, since you made the bold defense there.
Yeah, well, look, I think, as I said, I think the record and the historical achievements speak for themselves. I think the way in which we got to some of these things was very different than where President Obama thought we'd get to them in 2008, and very controversial along the way. And I think there's a lot of reasons to compare him, really, to Woodrow Wilson as a president. And in terms of an enormous set of historical achievements, largely progressive achievements, but sometimes working with people on the right, sometimes sharply criticized by people in his own party, being accused by people on Capitol Hill of being out of touch. All the editorial cartoons at the time had Woodrow Wilson as a professor lecturing the Congress. A lot of the same things, a lot of the same personality traits. But however he's gotten it done, and it's been different ways of working, sometimes just with Democrats, sometimes across the aisle, sometimes by executive action, sometimes as commander-in-chief on the wars, sometimes by just setting a moral tone on the inclusiveness. No, I think he's gotten it done. That's the bottom line.
Incidentally, for those interested, a friend and colleague at the Brookings Institution, Pietro Nivola, wrote a wonderful essay comparing Woodrow Wilson and Barack Obama and sort of detailing much of your case on the similarities. Chris?
I don't disagree with Ron's points on his achievements. Certainly health care, people criticized him for moving off the stimulus and taking on health care at that time, but it was right for taking on at that time. The Ted Kennedy forces who he owed a significant support in his election were pushing him to do it at the time, and it's certainly in time, just like Social Security was during FDR's period. I think in time, well, it's controversial now, and I think he should be grasping it now more and talking about the implementation of it in more positive lights than he has recently. But I think in time, that will be a major achievement. And I do think taking us from on the verge of falling off the fiscal cliff as we were in 2009 and saving that is too. But I also think that some of the really tough issues, like the grand bargain, which people want him to try to achieve on the deficit with the Republicans, hasn't been achieved, probably will not be achieved in the next 3.5, 4 years, is a failure that I think the public in the long term, is going to regret that he didn't achieve. So I think Joe Biden has been an enormous asset. Let's face it. Every
Ron's been
president,
emphatic.
and he can take credit for that, having been the chief of staff there. Joe, I met Joe when I had just gotten out of, let's see, I was in school getting ready to go out. He had just started in the Senate, and I interviewed in his staff, and I didn't go to work for him, but I've known him for 30 years, and he is right after the election last November, a perfect example. With the sequestration pending and everything else, he was able to cut a deal on the budget with the Republicans on the Hill. He went up there, and he has the relationships he's been able to build, and he did an excellent job. So I do think, and I do think on social justice, those of us who, and most of us I'm sure did, watch the state of his inaugural address, the second inaugural address in January. People were surprised at the general philosophical nature of it, and yet this was, I think, really, truly Barack Obama. He wants that social justice, open the doors, equal playing field opportunity for everyone to be part of his legacy, and he's done that in some smaller but significant steps, like the Marriage Act, like opening the doors to Gay and Lesbian Alliance and things like that. So I do think he has that legacy that he's building. But there are still elements of it that I think could have been stronger if he was able to work the Hill better.
I think that he was, and Ron would probably agree with this. I think President Obama would probably agree with this, which is when he was elected in 2008, the expectations were such that it would be impossible for anyone to have sort of met the expectations on the left, and kind of actually in the center too, but certainly on the left. It's impossible for him to have met them. I think a lot of people on the left thought we were going to close Gitmo on November, the election was November 6th. We're going to close Gitmo on November 7th and get all the truth out on November 8th, and we'll pass single-payer health care on November 9th. Done. Okay, the year's not even over with. Problem solved. The reality is, anyone who's worked on the Hill or knows the Hill knows that that's not possible. So I think he suffered from the overwhelming nature of his victory, which, look, you'd rather have an overwhelming victory than not, but it still set him up in some ways to fail almost no matter what he did. I do think, to your point, Luigi, I do think I think this is true with most politicians. It's definitely true with Barack Obama. There's a battle between pragmatist and sort of idealist. Bill Clinton is an example. They're all, at some level, there's some mix of that in all of us, and that I always say politicians are actually human. Good to remember that. They have those same sort of sets of motivations too. I look back, and I actually think he genuinely believed when he was elected that he, as a unique historical figure, the way in which he was elected, who he was, his background, that he was someone who would be able to bring people together. And I think he did attempt to do that. I actually look back to the whole debt ceiling debacle that happened in the summer of 2011. I remember it fell apart. I can't remember what grand bargain it was, but it was one of the many times we've discussed a possible grand bargain. It fell apart, and Barack Obama goes and gives a statement, and John Boehner goes and gives a statement. Both of them are clearly very worked up. You very rarely see emotion at that level of politician. They're good at not making clear how angry they are. That's one of those things you, I think, get better at. But
sometimes they're good at looking angry.
Right. They're good at masking emotion, no matter which way it goes. But both of them, but especially Obama, was clearly, I think, genuinely annoyed, and that probably gives way ultimately to frustration. And I think if you look from that point onward, he took a different and more successful electoral tack, I think. He was no longer sort of willing to reach out. Now, his re-election race was coming up, and there were a lot of other factors there, but I actually think he turned into a much more successful politician from that point onward, because I think he listened to maybe what Ron and what other folks in the administration were saying, which is, you think the Republicans are waiting to find something that they want to work with you on, and they are in fact not. I know for a fact people within the administration were saying to him, you are extending yourself, but there will be no hand back. And I think the debt ceiling crystallized that for him. And you saw a different, and I would argue more effective, again, agree or disagree with his policies, effective in terms of getting what he wanted done and the messaging he wanted out there from sort of August 2011 and certainly until November 2012, and actually through the fiscal cliff and, you know, into the early part of this year.
I want to ask each of you a different question here. By the way, on the debt ceiling, I do think the whole negotiating style became very controversial at the time, and those of you who read my column know I'm fairly sympathetic to President Obama, but I said at the time that if I ever have to negotiate a new house for a new house or a new car, I just won't ask the Obama administration to negotiate for me. Although,
But that's part of, I mean, I do think.
although they came back and told me they got a better deal than I thought.
I do think that is part of, you know, Democrats, especially liberals, always criticize the president. They said he negotiates with himself. He starts where he wants to end. I do think there is part of him that does think that he wants a deal. There is a very pragmatic part of him. I always said if he was an ideologue, he wouldn't have opted out of public financing in the 2008 campaign. He had said, I'm going to take public money. He looked at it, he said, well, John McCain can probably raise $50 million, and I can raise a lot. He probably thought, I can raise 150 or 200 million. They raised 750 million, and John McCain took public financing at 91 million. He is not a pure ideologue. He is smart, I say, smart politically, in that he makes those decisions. Say, this is pragmatic, but I think he wants to find common ground. It's just a question of, is there common ground to be found?
I want to open this up to you all. We'll have mics going around. Is that right? Or will just people be, well then, when I come to you, speak your question as loudly. Oh, we hadn't planned on Q&A from the audience. Oh, okay.
There are several college of 1998 grads who are here who are deeply informed about politics and ready.
Yes.
They're not just here because I'm here.
We'll only take questions from the class of 73,
Yeah.
98, and 83. Pardon me for not looking at my briefing book. Let me start with Ron. And this is a kind of governing question, which is if you look at two of the potentially very large legacies that are already cemented in law but not in regulation, which is the Health Care Act and Dodd-Frank. So much of his legacy is to be determined by regulation and implementation. And the healthcare law is particularly vulnerable because the decision to run so much of it through the states holds the president, as we all know, and the plan hostage to a lot of forces hostile to it. Can you talk a bit about your thinking about, you know, these two things, these two issues going forward?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there are very significant legislative achievements, but the devil is in the details, and the details is in implementation. On both Dodd-Frank and the Affordable Care Act, there's a lot of work left to be done. That said, I do think that there's a certain inevitability to the way in which healthcare is going to roll out. No matter what the Republicans try to do to block the funding for implementation, and no matter how many states resist, it's not really that different than Medicaid in many respects, which at first got a lot of resistance in the states, fought in the years after it was passed under President Johnson, but now is such an incredibly bedrock part of our healthcare system. Even the most conservative Republican governors aren't talking about rolling back the core of Medicaid. So I think that what you'll see is the Affordable Care Act get implemented in most of the states. There'll be a few holdouts from people fighting it back. People look around them. People in other states will have health care coverage. It'll be working. Prices will be going down, and people are going to want that. And so I think momentum, time just grinds this out. I think on Dodd-Frank, it's a very, very complex law. The SEC's moved to deal with some of it. There's some parts of it not yet. But again, I think it will get done. But this is a big project for the president and his White House in this term, in his second term. It's taking a lot of things that got done in the first 2 years and bringing them to their full fruition in his final 4 years. And how that comes out will color, I think, at least in the short term, how these legacy items are perceived. Though I do think in the long run, kind of time and history is on their side.
Let me ask Chris, I want to go back, the non-fixed Chris, about the 80s. I mean, you were on the Hill going back to 1979, and this relates to the question I want to ask the fixed Chris, which is the change in the Republican Party and how that's impacted, had such a large effect on President Obama's term. And it's I agree with you on all the factors you cited about people not going to Little League games together and all of that. I do think it's a terrible mistake for the country that people don't move here. Not because I want to further jack up Washington real estate prices, but because I think it has created more of a break. But I think fundamentally it's an ideological break, not any other kind. Talk about the change, not in light of the personal relations, but in light of shifting ideology. And Chris, as you know from reading all those comments underneath your, they could talk about comments too, but I won't. A lot of people come back at the media, and I'm on the liberal side myself, so I really get this argument that we pretend that there is equal, each party is equally distant from the center and all of that, where at this point that's just not true. So I want you to address that critique, but if Chris could talk a little bit about the change, again, not just personality and dealings, but ideology.
Yeah, well, I mean, as most people know, the Republican Party was a much broader tent back then. There was a very precise, moderate segment of the Republican Party. Even moderate liberal. In Connecticut, we had 6 congressmen, and at one point 3 were Republican and 3 were Democrat, and some of the Republicans were fairly moderate liberal. In fact, my opponent when I ran for Congress was the last remaining, I think, Republican in New England in the congressional delegation, Chris Shays. So, it now has been much, in fact, Bob Dole addressed that, I think, in his recent interview a week ago, how the Republican Party there is no room in the Republican Party for moderates anymore, and that has affected significantly their ability to get a national coalition. I mean, last summer, it was just so, I could see the puzzle pieces be moving around in the Obama campaign. They went from one constituency group to the next on issues. They had the gay-lesbian issue, they had the health care money for Catholic and non-Catholic institutions issues going to the women's vote. They had immigration that they talked about. They went from one constituency to the next, and you had the Republican Party sitting there watching it all and not able to address that because they had alienated women on issues, they had alienated Hispanics on issues, and so until they, in fact now you talk about the legacy, I mean, if immigration passes at all, many say it won't be simply because President Obama supports it, which is important, but if he lets the Republicans and Marco Rubio take the lead on it, then the Republicans will get some credit for it and enable them to build somewhat of a base in the Hispanic sector for the next presidential election. So it's all about putting those votes together to get to 51%. And the women's vote, that Democratic presidential candidates have gotten the last few times repeatedly, the Republicans have lost on that. And then they need to figure out an agenda to pick that up as well. So the fact that their positions have become more right-wing, the fact that they don't have that mainstream segment of the party that the way they used to, I think diminishes their ability to put together the coalition to win the national races.
Briefly on that, I think that Michelle Bachmann's retirement this week is a good example. Michelle Bachmann, and I don't even, her defenders, and there are some, well, there are.
How many? 4 or 5?
There are. I talked to them this week. I don't even think her defenders would say this is someone who left a lasting imprint on Congress. She really, I mean, she ran very briefly for congressional leadership. It was literally like a one-day campaign, and then she dropped out because she was going to get, 30 votes, and her opponent was going to get 200 votes. But I do think her model is an interesting one in which the ability of a backbench member of Congress, this is true with Democrat or Republican, it happens to be Michelle Bachmann in this case, to become a national figure based on sort of, I guess, some combination of charisma, which I think she has a certain amount of, willingness to sort of say somewhat controversial things, social media, cable. There's a whole different avenue that exists. You can become a national figure. In the 80s, there is no Michelle Bachmann in that regard. There's just no way because, like, Tip O'Neill never, like, there's no, you can't get there where you can now. And we've seen this. Ted Cruz is a great example of this. I mean, Ted Cruz is someone who is, I mean, expressed zero interest in legislating, really. I mean, he said, like, I think Congress does too much. I think we should do less. And he's become a big figure in the party by doing less. Marco Rubio runs a risk, which he acknowledges because he is in the game on immigration, and if it goes in a way that looks bad. So I just say that there's the way in which people consume politics, people consume media, has drastically altered your ability to rise and fall in a way that never was the case, even in the 90s. I mean, even, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Ron, could you talk about that? And then we have empowered the audience. Thank you so much. So we're going to turn to you. But, on the one hand, whenever people say things are way worse now, I go back and say, well, they did impeach Bill Clinton. I mean, this was hardly a kind of friendly act. On the other hand, things are, on the other hand, things are quite different. When you think of even just from the 90s to now,
Right.
could you talk a bit about that on party and media, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Well, as I alluded to before, I do teach on campus, and when I want to persuade the students that I'm very, very old, I tell this story. That when I worked in the Clinton White House in 1996, the Washington Post was going to break the politics-changing story that there was Chinese influence, Chinese money in our political system. And it was going to really transform the 1996 campaign, and it ultimately did in some ways in October of 1996. And what we did was we sat in the yellow oval room of the president's residence, and we waited for some person to come back from the Washington Post loading dock and bring us a copy of the Bulldog edition of the Washington Post so we could read this story to find out what was in the story, okay? Now that's 1996, not 1896, not 1966, right? So if you think about...
I thought we met on the Bryan campaign.
Yeah. So if you think about, a relatively short period of time of having the president of the United States sitting around waiting for someone to walk a newspaper back to the White House, to today, where if I haven't read what Chris has posted in the past 7 minutes, I'm out of date of what's important in American politics. Just the
That's
pace.
exactly how Chris views it.
Thank you for that endorsement.
The pace of all of this has changed. Now, I will say this. I think it's also a lot more democratic. That is, it also was true in 1996 that if you wanted to really know what was going on in American politics, you had to be in Washington. And I think one great thing is that if you are sitting any place in America, you have equal access to what Chris writes on Twitter, on Facebook, on his blog, in a way that's broadened access to political information, cable, all these things. It is much more of a national conversation than it was 20 years ago. It was a conversation inside the Beltway. And I'm sure there are negative things about that in terms of polarization and whatnot. There's a lot of positive things about it. It's a much more open system in terms of a national dialogue, a national conversation than it was 20 years ago.
And to add to Ron's point, I think, and big mainstream media companies, including the Washington Post, are dealing with this, but a democratization of content, too. I mean, it used to be, back then it was like, well, the Washington Post, back then, I mean, I graduated from college 2 years later, so again, it's not like, and we took the horse and buggy, but,
I can't tell you how old I'm feeling.
Yeah. But there is a leveling. Back then it was the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, AP, and then the broadcast networks, and maybe the LA Times. Now, I mean, people always say like, oh, hey, what's your competition? Well, I mean, it's basically like anybody who can type onto the internet and put their, which is basically everyone at this point. That's an oversimplification, but it is in fact true. And I do think that is a great thing for journalists. We are way more accountable now than we used to be. I always joke is, people would say, oh, that story generated a lot of talk. I had 2 letters to the editor from that. It's like, I mean, now you have like instantaneous, I just get one thing wrong, or I like misspell the name of a character in Game of Thrones on my Twitter feed. People are like, it has an E in it. How could you get that? And people are, I mean, these are people who mostly live in their parents' basement, but regardless, I mean, whatever, it's fine. That's a respectable life. But the point is that it I think helps keep us on our toes in a positive way. There's a lot of vitriol out there. I think you have to put that out, but it keeps us on our toes, and that's a good thing, ultimately, for everything what we're all after.
But if I could just add, it does keep us journalists and others on our toes, but when you're flooding the public with so much information on a rapid, every second basis, it's hard for folks who are raising a family and working and everything else to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so you have public officials sitting there, taking votes on things and getting, just like on the gun vote and the NRA, where there's a lot of misinformation out there, it makes it tougher for public officials to take those votes when they're getting feedback from people who may not have the full information on issues. And so it's
I'm going to make one observation and then turn to the first question in the audience, which is, I love the new technology and I enjoy participating in it, but there's that old line that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. And I think that the new media make spreading truth more efficient, but they also make spreading untruth more efficient. And it's a really interesting problem for all kinds of media and for citizens right now. And eventually there's a correcting process, but I've always thought that when something really bad about someone gets out there and it's totally untrue, they never fully shed it. It's always in the back of people's heads, even if it's wrong. And I just still think that's a problem that I don't know how we...
I mean, can you imagine a decade ago the President of the United States going to the White House briefing room and with the copy of his birth certificate to privilege his I mean, it's remarkable the power that those... And I still get emails, from people. Have you seen the birth certificate? I'm like, I don't spend a lot of time on that particular topic, but the power of it is remarkable.
Sir, thank you.
Yes. You mentioned early on we would get to subjects like Benghazi and the IRS, so I wonder if we can turn to that real quick. So I think the administration is trying to present an image that Republicans are making a mountain out of a molehill. But simple facts are that there was a terrorist attack last 9/11 on sovereign U.S. soil right before the election. And there clearly was some attempt to try to divert attention from what had happened for political purposes due to President Obama, specifically Secretary of State Clinton, leaving the homeland unprotected. That embassy was left unprotected. So I wonder how that is going to continue to play out. Specifically, I'm interested in what my friend Ron Klain thinks, and whether that's going to affect Obama's legacy, or is it just a speed bump and it moves into history? And then I have a similar question regarding the IRS issue.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll assume the IRS as part of this discussion. Do you want to answer first?
Well, look, I think obviously it was a horrible tragedy at Benghazi, and I think the brave people who were there trying to protect our diplomats, several of whom lost their lives, wouldn't say the facility was unprotected, so it wasn't protected well enough. But I think that there was no effort to cover it up. Obviously, everyone knew what happened. The president called it an act of terror the next day, and has obviously conducted a full review of what went wrong and trying to buttress our security at our embassies to prevent it from happening again. I think, let's be honest, I think the fact that there's a lot of noise and strum and drang about this on Capitol Hill has a lot more to do with Republicans' views of Hillary Clinton's 2016 candidacy than issues about embassy security. But I hope we do get a better embassy security policy out of this, and I hope we do more to prevent those kinds of incidents from happening in the future. I think on the IRS, obviously, we need to get to the bottom of that. We need to figure out what actually happened, who gave the orders, why there appears to be there was unevenness in the enforcement of this, these rules and regulations. And I think it's still too soon to say why all that happened. I don't think there's any evidence that anyone at the White House was given any orders or suggesting that people do that. I think that, that's why I don't think this is a scandal that touches in the end the White House, the president, or senior officials of the administration. But he's the president of the United States. He's responsible for the conduct of the government. He's responsible for what officials are doing under his authority, and the IRS is part of that. And he's got to clean it up and straighten it out and fix it. And I think I hear people talk about restoring confidence in the IRS. I don't remember the era when there was a lot of confidence in the IRS, but I certainly think every American has a right to be equally skeptical about the IRS, whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a moderate, and equally hate the IRS no matter what your political perspective is, and that's what we've got to get back to.
I am so tempted, not on this, but on other. I actually once wrote a column on April 15th praising the men and women of the IRS. It's probably the least popular column I've ever written in my life. But who wants to take either Benghazi, the holy or otherwise trinity of Benghazi, the press story, the Justice Department, and the IRS?
I just wanted to say that, you know, these are important. You know, Ron has mentioned the specifics of each, but they're important in the sense that they distract the administration from focusing what they really want to focus on. I think it's no surprise that President Obama gave a speech on the shifting policy toward terrorism in this country the other day, because I think, like most second-term presidents, they want to try to shift the attention away from domestic issues and onto foreign issues. And in fact, in the second term of most term presidents, they spend a lot of time on foreign travel. In terms of Benghazi and IRS and the Department of Justice and AP, those are like the three thorny issues lately. I agree with Ron wholeheartedly. I think Benghazi, and once the emails came out and it was pretty clear that the administration wasn't trying to hide anything, I think this is really all about 2016, and it's all about keeping Hillary feet to the fire and maybe trying to discourage her from running. In terms of the IRS and in terms of the president, the major poll that was done right after those three stories were in the headlines almost every day. The CNN poll showed Obama had a 53% job approval rating, which is frankly slightly higher. After the conventions last September, you know, people were worried about him a little bit because it was around 49 or 50%, and the old tradition is you got to be over 50% to win re-election. So it didn't seem to affect his job approval rating. The IRS's reputation was still down in the tank, and yet the public in the poll thought that the Republicans on the Hill were doing what they should do to at least look into it. But you know, back in the Bush administration, doesn't make it right, but there were stories back in the Bush administration that they were over-scrutinizing progressive groups' applications. I personally don't think any of these groups should have tax-exempt status, but whether they're on one side or the other, but that's a separate issue, and there was an editorial in the New York Times about that recently. And in terms of the Department of, but the IRS has the ability, which is why I think the president has been more vocal about that than anything, to connect with people, because we'll all file tax returns, or should, and so we can relate to what can go on within there, and until all the facts come out as to how much the White House knew, there doesn't seem to be any connection between the White House and what went on in the IRS, but the question now is, were there people in the White House that didn't tell the president about an unfavorable report that was going to come out about it in advance, and should he have known? And the last issue, in terms of the AP and Department of Justice, you know, I think it's an important issue. It's interesting. You find Republicans now who are become civil libertarians when they were always national security folks, because they're concerned about this. And clearly, you know, I think in terms of a subpoena, AP should have been told in advance. But you know, I don't know all the intricacies of that. But it's more of an inside the beltway sort of issue, an inside the media sort of issue, than I think it is an issue that appeals broadly to the public. So from a political standpoint, it's important for the White House to get beyond these things and get back to implementing health care and dealing with getting immigration through, and dealing with some of the other issues that are on his plate for the second term legacy.
I'm glad Chris raised the regulation. Lawrence O'Donnell's made a crusade of this. The 54 tax acts and 501c4s should be exclusively for social welfare purposes. The regulation 5 years later interpreted that as primarily, this is a Catholic college. Try reinterpreting your marriage vow as going from exclusively to primarily. See, and I think that, and I think that whatever happened here, and we should find out, a messed up interpretation, I think, and an unclear regulation is at the heart of this problem. But we have another gentleman or lady over here. Sir.
Gentlemen, I hope. I wanted to raise the issue of foreign policy in a bit broader sense than Benghazi and so on. And as a focal point, Vali Nasser, who was Richard Holbrooke's special assistant back a couple of years ago, and dean at the International School at Johns Hopkins, just has written a book about foreign policy. It's really quite critical of the administration. I think taking it to task, if I was to summarize, that it has a lack of vision, and that our foreign policy, in an important sense, is in a sense of drift. So I was wondering what comments the panel might have on that.
Well,
You should talk about it. You know more about foreign policy than I do.
well, why don't you start? I'm here.
Sure. I mean, you know, I think because the economy, President Obama has acknowledged that when he came into office, the economy was worse than he thought. Because anytime the economy matters, anytime, and when it matters, almost always is when it's struggling, when it matters politically. They spent so much time on that and healthcare in the first term that, in truth, I don't want to say foreign policy got left behind because it didn't, but I think that the vast majority of the focus that the Obama team put on things was in domestic policy because they understood that that's where people cared about. They understand that when the economy is bad, that's literally the only thing people care about. I went and gave speeches a few years ago in Europe, and it was really cool. The first question they always ask is, well, what does America think of Brussels? You know, and I said, you know, to be honest, the average American, I don't think at this point right now is thinking all that much about Brussels. Maybe right, Brussels sprouts, or they would like to go to Brussels, but they're not. The truth is, when the economy is in tough shape, people, we very rarely look beyond our shores. Not everybody, but the majority of people very rarely look beyond our shores. Normally, that is doubly true when the economy isn't doing well. So I think the president recognized that reality and focused very heavily on domestic matters. I think Chris makes a good point that you're likely to see more of a focus on foreign issues, though too, Ron is right. I mean, look, wars are foreign policy. Yeah, I mean, you know, Afghanistan, Iraq, the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden, I mean, these are not broad sort of Nixon goes to China, but these matter in serious ways. So, you know, do I think they focused more on domestic policy? Yes. Do I think the American people wanted them to focus more on domestic policy? Absolutely. Also, yes. I mean,
Ron, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I mean, I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think, as Chris alluded to, I do think that the president's focus on war on terror, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are a very substantial foreign policy focus. If you have a child who's in college, you know, that every day since that child's been 9 years old, Americans have been in combat. We have great ROTC Corps of Cadets here on campus. When those people showed up here as freshmen, they thought they were leaving here to go command troops in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. Next year, we will have no Americans in combat. They will all be home. And that's a significant foreign policy achievement. People who attacked our country on 9/11, the leader of them has been killed under President Obama. All the other significant lieutenants have been brought to justice, captured, or killed themselves. You know, that is a significant part of the foreign policy. I know there are folks who wanted to see us do more nation building in Afghanistan, and Ambassador Holbrooke was one of those. There are folks who wanted to see us do more nation building in Iraq. But I think the president has made a priority of ending those, doing what we could do responsibly, reasonably. American people put more than a decade of their sons and daughters and tens of billions of dollars in those two countries. And I think the president made a responsible choice. It's time now for the people of those two countries to take over and for us to bring our troops and our people home. And I think that certainly is the centerpiece of President Obama's foreign policy. I don't think that's all of President Obama's foreign policy. I think he's done a lot to rebuild our relationships around the world. We were afraid under President Bush. I think he's done a lot to rebuild our relationships in Europe. There's been a lot of the big foreign policy issue in the first 4 years has been global economic cooperation and dealing with the economic troubles in the Eurozone and working very closely with leaders over there to try to manage that in a way that didn't collapse our economy. I think, you know, knock wood, so far that's been successful. I think there's going to be a renewed focus in the next 3 years of our relationship with China and to turn to Asia, as EJ mentioned. It's going to be a very significant part of our foreign policy in the next 3 years. And hopefully, you know, as EJ said at the outset, we're very brief into the president's second term. Hopefully, 3 years from now, I think we'll look back on what the president did to engage China, to work with China on significant issues as a big part of his foreign policy legacy.
I just want to say 30 seconds on your question, which is a good one. I think it's very significant that the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who's named Richard Haas, who worked in both Bush administrations, it's actually an old friend of mine, I should disclose, has written a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. That's the last thing you would ever expect the president of the Council on Foreign Relations to write. And he wrote that book because he argues, and I think this is a kind of instinct among Americans right now, that in order to preserve American power for the long haul, we have to get some things right at home. at the moment, and we have to make some adjustments. And I do think there's a war weariness in the country. You see it in the polls on Syria. There's a lot of support among, there's a lot of elite support for more intervention in Syria. There's not a lot of popular support. And so I think we are in one of those periods where we believe we need to strengthen ourselves in fundamental ways at home in order to preserve and have our power for the long run. But it's a very interesting book. Oh, it's right up there. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Georgetown University today for putting together such a ideologically rigorous panel. We have a liberal journalist on the left with EJ. We have the partisan hack with Ron in the middle. We have a former Democratic candidate for some office sitting to his left, and we have the centrist Chris Cillizza. So I'd like to thank them for putting together such an ideologically rigorous panel. The question is, looking back at the way we look at presidents, we look back at Bill Clinton as the first black president, whether jokingly or not. We look at George W. Bush as the first legacy president. There are some similarities between Bush and Obama that really haven't been discussed today. The first I'd like to say is probably they both wouldn't be where they were today without who their father was. Second of all, I would also say that a lot of the issues that really affect our future, talking about large deficits, the Fed just literally giving banks a whole crap load of money, that kind of stuff. Ron doesn't want to talk about that. I can understand why. But the bottom line is we have probably a president here who is overmatched a little bit with the size and scope of the federal government. As David Axelrod said, how do we keep track of all the stuff that's going on? How am I supposed to know what's going on in these offices in Cincinnati and places like Benghazi? There's a lot of government activities going on. So how am I supposed to be able to keep track of it? I agree. There's a lot of government going on. I think what you're going to end up with a legacy here is, Obama's probably going to be remembered as someone who was probably the first affirmative action president, who won president for, the color of his skin rather than anything else. So I'd like you to discuss that point and maybe.
All right.
The question is, do you think that Obama is the first? Do you think that Obama is the first affirmative action president?
Oh, just before we get to that, I personally take some offense to the question, but I also believe passionately in free speech, so I'm glad you asked it. I want to say that the original panel was supposed to have Paul Clement on it, who is a very staunch conservative, and he had to cancel at the last moment. So Georgetown did care about ideological diversity. And I say that as somebody who was brought among other people, Pat Buchanan and Mike Gerson, to my own classes. So I do believe in philosophical diversity. But let's... the gentleman raised a series of questions that reflect a certain reaction to the president and also, and I think could allow us to sort of offer some closing comments on the Obama legacy. Let me start with
Sure.
Chris.
Well, let me answer the question as asked first, and then I can talk more broadly. I would say I think Barack Obama's background, an African father, a white mother, largely raised by his grandparents in Hawaii, did clearly, in the same way that my background as a dad who's a teacher, a mother who works in healthcare, raised in Connecticut, how our background, of course, impacts our who we are. Do I think he was elected because he is African American? No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think he was elected in large part some combination of who he was and who people believe he represented, which I think a lot of people believed he represented sort of the American story in some capacity. And frankly, and you can debate how much it was, 50-50, 80-20, I think some significant part of it was his name was not George W. Bush and he did not have an R after it. That is the reality of that 8 years. Many people just wanted a change. John McCain, people say, well, what if they nominated Mitt Romney in 2000? I don't think it would have made a huge difference. But I think the broader question that you raise as it relates to size of government, it is sort of the crux of the ongoing debate that we have in this country between the two parties. Bill Clinton very famously declared the era of big government over Bill Clinton, a Democrat. I think Barack Obama was elected, at least in part. People point to Iraq as the thing that brought George Bush down, but if you look at the numbers, and the numbers aren't everything, but if you look at the numbers would suggest that Hurricane Katrina and the handling of that, coupled with Iraq, helped bring it down. Barack Obama was elected, at least in part, to bring back competency and make the government do well those things the government should do. I think people have, and you can look at this in polling, people have incredibly contradictory views within their own mind about what the government should do. Should everyone be covered by health care? Yes. Well, we probably have to raise your tax to do that. Well, that's not, we're not. You know, I mean, we contain multitudes, often very contradictory multitudes. And I think where we are as a country right now is in this battle between, there is a libertarian strain, particularly among younger people. They want government out of their personal lives. And yet when the Moore, Oklahoma tornado happens, when Hurricane Sandy happens, there is this broad agreement. It's not unanimous, but there's a broad agreement. Even a majority of Republicans in the poll we did said we should not offset the money that goes to the tornado relief. We don't need to offset it with the federal budget. That is, let's just spend it and worry about it later. So there is this constant battle. I don't envy people from Barack Obama, the sort of top politician in the country, on down, who have to deal with this. Because if in part your job is to lead and in part your job is to sort of channel the desires and wants of the populace, I don't know that the country knows what they want. And Chris mentioned Bob Dole earlier, we're not closing this. You know, Bob Dole got a lot of attention for saying they should close the Republican Party for repairs. I thought the more interesting thing that he said was, the American people, and this was earlier in the interview, but he said, I'm paraphrasing, the American people don't really know what they want, and that's kind of the problem. So, yes, leaders and politicians are supposed to lead, but they are also elected officials, elected by us to carry out sort of our desires, hopes, dreams, ambitions, keep us from our fears, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are often very contradictory at the moment, and it's why I think you see this massive polarization between people who think that Barack Obama is the greatest president ever and people who, my guess is, think that Barack Obama is among the worst presidents ever.
Chris?
Well, Chris is making a lot of good points that I agree with, and I'm not going to go on at length. To get back to part of your question, and you answered most of his, but if, you know, I still think the legacy of Barack Obama is tied into the economic cliff of 2009 and the healthcare initiative and opening up opportunities in a broader sense in social justice. I think he's more than an affirmative action president, but I remember how proud people were after the last election to think that we in the United States could elect a person of color. And I remember, too, many years ago, I'm the person you said who ran for something. Well, you know, I represented a Republican district in the Connecticut legislature. I had a coalition of moderates. I was one of the early members of the DLC, which was what Bill Clinton and Al Gore organized to sort of mainstream the party. But I remember saying I used to speak to young women all the time. When I was elected first at the age of 27, and I'd speak in high schools and even 7th and 8th graders, young girls thinking of going into politics or whatever else that they could make it happen. But we always sort of seem to believe that a man of color would get elected to the White House before a woman would. So if this presidency, in addition to his legacy that you may think is good or bad or certainly not complete, does anything, perhaps it transforms us to the next step in thinking that we might elect a woman in this country the next time around so people are more comfortable with that.
Thank you. Ron?
Well, it's my reunion, so I'm in a good mood. So I'm going to try not to take too much offense at a statement that was offensive. And if the suggestion is that somehow President Obama isn't up to the job because he's African American, it's particularly offensive. Well, to call him an affirmative action president, I'm not sure what that means. If the suggestion is that being black is a huge advantage in American politics, then I doubt he would be the first black president. I doubt we'd have so few black members of the Senate and so few black governors. So apparently it's not a huge advantage in American politics. I'll tell you what I do think about Barack Obama, though. It's a person who graduated from Columbia University. It's not quite Georgetown. It's still a very good school. Was president of the Harvard Law Review. Still not quite Georgetown Law School, but a very good law school. has gone on to serve with distinction in the U.S. Senate and as our president. And I think there's no question about this man's intellect, ability, achievements, and again, you can dispute his policies. I understand there's a passionate disagreement about the points I made about whether or not you agree with the health care reform, whether or not you agree with Dodd-Frank, whether or not you agree with the ways in which we save the auto companies and turn the economy around, whether or not you agree with his national security things. But his talent, his aptitude, the skills and passion he's brought to the job, I think, are facts that are very, very hard to dispute. You know, in terms of some of the more specifics, as I said, he inherited a huge deficit. He's brought it down. There was no grand bargain, but between policies of cuts, increases in revenues, the sequester, for better or worse, we're headed down to a deficit that's headed down toward 3% of GDP. It's getting under control. You know, look, and I think bottom line, we see the improvement in the economy, and we see the other legacy items I met. But I do think, do I think the Obama presidency is a historic one? I do, obviously. I think it's historic because of who he is, how he and what he represents, the kind of change he's brought to the country, his accomplishments, and I look forward to being back here in 3 years when this is all over and debating it all again.
Thank you so much. I just want to say 3 quick things in closing. The first is my favorite response of a politician who was dealing with a crowd that was really coming at him. It was Barney Frank, was at a very difficult town meeting. And finally he looked up and he said, look, we politicians are no great shakes, but you voters are no day at the beach either. I've always loved that line. The second point I want to make very quickly, and the passion in some of the conversation here reflects, I think, the fact that we Americans are really sort of, our experiment is rooted in 2 sets of ideas. One set about community and solidarity, and the other set about liberty and individualism. And that we as a country are constantly looking for the right balance between those 2 sets of values, and that we happen to be having a particularly sharp debate right now in the country. But in the end, I still think it's good for us to remember that we're actually best off when we figure out a right balance between the 2 rather than put one set or the other set aside. Last point I want to make is to thank this distinguished panel of Georgetown graduates and this distinguished Georgetown audience. One of the great things about teaching here and being a student here is the extraordinary diversity of view among students and among graduates, and that view is expressed intelligently and well tutored by our Jesuits and those who follow in a great tradition. Thank you all for being here.